Okay, for the pallet logic we're talking about um, so far, and has a couple issues we need to look at it. So firstly is initially in the simulation, the pallet was generated. Every time it got full, it regenerated another pallet when the pallet was leaving the palletizer. And I want you to notice when there are uh, enough parts right here, they're fine. Or when there are not enough part, they will wait for a specific time and to move on. And however, if there's no parts actually in the member input buffer and the pallet arrives, for example, at this moment, it's supposed to the pallet is going to move on with only 4 entities. And the next pallet arrived, there's nobody in the buffer, and the empty pallet will go ahead and move on after 5 minutes. So this is something we want, or there's just something we can do about it. We do not want the empty pallets to move on by itself. I want the empty pallets to wait. Um, we do have a process in place when we check this after angels becomes alive. Let me double check this. And we're using a pallet member input buffer contents number weighting is greater or equals to 0. If I say it's just greater than 0, meaning I have to check if the pallet has something in there. If not, I'm going to go ahead dispose or get rid of the angel logic. Um, so this kind of situations is going to be, let's see how that works. If I just strictly say there has to be something in the buffer, just take a look. I'm going to run this a little bit faster. Okay, in this case, the pallet will now move on and go ahead dispose the angel. And this particular empty pallet will wait until the next time it got full because there's no angel guarding it anymore or come back to check. The pallet will wait longer than 40 minutes, for example. The pallet the empty pallet will not move on in that case. And how should I rectify this situation? So here I'm going to start talking about we can slightly make some changes on this models and make it work for what we need. The first what we do is when we generate palette in the previous homework, it's based on an event to generate the palette. It's based on the output of palletizer access. So something come out of here and the palletizer we generate. So every time a pallet passes through here, I regenerate a new pallet. And see if we can change that. So we're going to use the simul user-defined event. We'll call the palette needed, for example. I'll call this event. Every time this event happens, and I'll request palette. So here, instead of using output palletizer exit, I'm going to use palette needed event. So I'm going to generate palette based on this event happen. But when when I need a palette, I want to explain these two things. First is when a new part come in and there's nobody in the input buffer queue, member input buffer, then I request a palette. Or when the palette leaves and I check the input buffer have something needs to be done. So here I'm going to put one triggers, the add-on event when a parse entering the member input. So I'm going to do that. And first I'm going to decide, okay, based on condition, my palletizer member input buffer content number waiting is equals to 0. If that's the case, I need to request a pallet. How do I trigger that particular event to happen? So I'm going to trigger that event by using a fire command. So we say need pallet. Okay, and I'm going to trigger this particular event called pallet needed. So if there is nobody's in the input buffer when a parts arrive, and that means I'm the first parts arrive to the empty palletizer, so I'm going to request a pallet. Or when the parts actually leaving the palletizer, so combiner exit portion. Do we have that combiner exit portion? I can decide. So here I'm just changing. I'm going to put it on a decide block, and based on if palletizer member input buffer contain number of waiting is greater than 0. If upon leaving of the pallet to that space, if a pallet leaves the palletizer and I see more parts waiting in the member input buffer, then I need to request for a pallet again. So here is fairly easy. I'm going to request a pallet. Okay, so same thing, need pallet. So we see how this is working so far. Sorry. And I also don't need the first one in the beginning of the simulation for the source. So now the source is only generates pallet based on this particular event, and I have two places defining trigger of this event or fire this event when the member input arrival upon an empty member buffer, or when the pallet leaves, there's something else is still in waiting in the input buffer. So this is what I have. I'm going to enlarge this a little bit, rearrange. Okay, let's see how this is working. Initially, there's no pallet needed. I'm sorry. And when there's a part continues filling into the member, okay, this pallet is waiting and move on. So no pallet coming anymore until the next batch of input, next batch of part arrive. Okay, next batch is arriving, and then pallet is going to get generated. So here we request a pallet either a parts arrive to this member input buffer input when the input buffer is empty, or when the pallet leaves and there's something more waiting for here. So we can make this pallet logic more realistic, and that concludes the supplement part of this pallet logic.